the Jedi are among cinema's most beloved fictional characters.
I've been looking forward to this.
Captivating audiences with their iconic lightsaber weapons, their amazing force powers, an inspiring philosophy, and their dark side nemesis that offer an engaging shadow reflection. So why is it that Star Wars has no idea what to do with them? I feel like the Jedi have been suffering from somewhat of an identity crisis for some time now. Like they are stuck between conflicting ideas of what they are supposed to be in the modern Star Wars universe. I couldn't really find a good term to describe it, but in my mind the problem came to be known as Schrödinger's Jedi, which refers to that quantum physics idea where unless you actually observe and examine something, it exists in multiple states at once and basically remains suspended in a paradox. You probably already have some notion of what I'm talking about here. I've already felt that tension between the more classical idea of the lightsaber warriors as these aspirational heroes standing against the dark side, and the more modern perspective that contextualizes them as a somewhat problematic religious and political organization.
I think the Jedi are a massive system of unchecked power, posing as a religion, a delusional cult that claims to control the uncontrollable.
But it's not just an issue of Jedi good or Jedi bad. No, I think the real issue points to a deeper problem of quality in the way that the Jedi story is told, the way their philosophy, their lore and general identity is progressed and expanded upon. Looking at some recent Star Wars movies and shows, the extent of this issue becomes pretty obvious. Like, have you noticed how the most popular ones are those that don't focus on the Jedi at all? And how it might be precisely because they steered away from them that they were able to actually do something interesting? Rogue One and Andor both expanded on the rebellion storyline, exploring, among other things, the complexities of revolt and the dynamics of oppression.
The pace of oppression outstrips our ability to understand it, and that is the real trick of the Imperial thought machine. It's easier to hide behind 40 atrocities than a single incident.
And The Mandalorian provided an entertaining adventure in the world of bounty hunting, which, while not necessarily expanding the mythos in a significant way, did offer nice little everyday glimpses into the Star Wars universe with its episodic structure. By contrast, modern stories that do center the Jedi, most notably the sequel trilogy but also Obi-Wan Kenobi, Ahsoka and The Acolyte, all received mixed responses, with some of them remaining highly divisive to this day. All of these recent iterations, of course, have their own particular storytelling issues, but at their core, I think much of it comes down to that deeper crisis of identity and Star Wars' inability or unwillingness to resolve it, that is, preventing the Jedi from progressing forward in a meaningful way.
They're not with me. Ugh.
So let's break this down, because I think it's actually a bit more complicated than it appears, let alone fix, though I will certainly try towards the end of this video. The thing is, a problem like this is usually more common, or at least much easier to recognize, with plot-related story elements instead of with the more foundational cornerstones that give them meaning. What do I mean by this? Well, just look at the show The Boys, which I think could have been a fantastic 3-season show about the conflict between the villainous superhero Homelander and the titular boys that stand against him. But in today's landscape, where it feels like every movie must become an ongoing franchise and every show seems increasingly designed to set up a next season, your main conflict cannot be resolved or else your story would be over. And so you have to keep pushing back the horizon. I guess we could call this Schrödinger's plot, a story that is actively avoiding to resolve its main conflict to stretch engagement as long as possible. Anyways, now The Boys is 5 seasons long, and you can tell it's artificially padding that runtime with all kinds of subplots and other distractions that leave the main conflict open-ended, and that just kind of keep the story going without really moving it forward. I still like the show, but this is just bad storytelling in my opinion. Like, you obviously don't have to rush to the ending, but I think each story has a more or less natural course, and I think the goal should be to find that course and align your pacing to it, however short or long that is. You know, it should be about quality, not quantity. With the Jedi, it gets a bit more complicated because, again, with their story, it's not really the plot that's being held in stasis, but something more foundational. It's their very identity itself.
What if the democracy we thought we were serving no longer exists, and the Republic has become the very evil we've been fighting to destroy?
It can be argued that the roots of this go back to the prequel trilogy, where the Jedi were already placed in a different, more critical light compared to the original movies, as it was shown that Anakin's tragic downfall and transformation into Darth Vader was in part the result of the Jedi failing to properly guide him during his troubled times.
Something's happening. I'm not the Jedi I should be.
The Pop Culture Detective already made a really insightful video about this, detailing how the Jedi's misguided approach to handling fear, trauma, and emotion in general increasingly pushed Anakin into isolation and made him more vulnerable to corruption by the dark side.
The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
Personally, however, I've always found the prequel trilogy a bit hard to read in terms of authorial intent of what George Lucas really wanted to say here, especially regarding the Jedi. I think it's clear that he didn't view the Jedi as perfect, but I don't believe he truly questioned the essence of their philosophy either. Not deliberately, at least. And not to the extent that audiences walked away confused about the idea of the Jedi in general. I think that at the end of the prequels, even if the Jedi fell short of their aspirations, even if they let themselves become a little bit too dogmatic, too politically involved, they were still mostly aligned to their original vision, still perceived as the force of that which is good, while their dark side counterparts still embodied that which is bad. The real shift, the real genesis of the Jedi identity crisis, I think happened during the sequel trilogy, where George Lucas was no longer in control of the franchise and the reins had been handed over to Disney and, for some reason, two directors with an entirely different vision of what Star Wars is and where it should go. And this is where we get to The Last Jedi, and I know this movie has been talked about to death. It became one of the most controversial blockbusters ever made, but now, 8 years later, with the dust having settled a bit, I feel like there's still a lot about it that has remained undiscussed. However, once I went down into that rabbit hole, I quickly realized that it was just too much for this video, which is why I made an entirely separate essay that you can watch right now exclusively on Nebula. I'll talk more about that at the end, but what matters for this discussion here is that in the sequel trilogy and in The Last Jedi in particular, there emerged a slightly different mode of storytelling that placed the Jedi at a sort of narrative crossroads that still hasn't been resolved. If I had to capture this transformation in one sentence, I'd say that in the original trilogy and in the prequels, the Jedi were an ideal complicated by politics, whereas in this new vision they have become politics complicated by idealism. I'm not 100% sure if that makes sense, but it points to that idea that while Star Wars has always had political subtext, its foundation used to be more like a myth or fairy tale that symbolically applied to our world and to ourselves without being directly allegorical. And today, while I wouldn't say that balance has fully reversed, I do think that the emphasis has shifted more towards Star Wars being sociological. That it's now a more direct mirror of our society rather than truly being that mythic story from a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
There's only one business in the galaxy that'll get you this rich.
War.
Good guys, bad guys, made up words.
Part of this was arguably inevitable, as it was just, and still is, a larger sign of the times. That significant rise of legacy sequels engaging in meta-level conversations with themselves, and the general cultural movement towards irony, realism, and self-aware storytelling.
How's that?
Like, really corny.
So corny.
But anyways, as a consequence, some of the elements that were once considered sacred, that we were able to take for granted in that more mythological context, have now become subjected to disenchantment and deconstruction. As mentioned in the beginning, I don't think this was that big of a deal for the rebels and the bounty hunters, which didn't suffer conceptually from this evolution. Again, the rebels may have actually become more interesting because of it, as their stories have since been enriched with more intricate real-world ideas and commentaries.
I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see.
But the thing about the Jedi, and I'm going to risk getting myself cancelled by die-hard Star Wars fans here, is that when you actually deconstruct them, there just isn't all that much left.
You will know when you are calm, at peace, passive.
The Jedi used to form the spiritual bedrock of the story, in the sense that if the rebels and the Empire were fighting over the material galaxy, then the Jedi and the Sith were battling for its soul, which I think worked great. But in a more sociological context, that battle for the soul becomes just another aspect of the material reality. It becomes more grounded, more politicized, and when you truly examine the Jedi as such, that's when you realize, for one, that their philosophy has never really been more than a grab bag of vaguely Buddhist and Stoic ideas. You know, good enough for a few one-liners and general mantras, good enough to add texture to their identity in the original story, but that's about it. Then of course there's the rather cultist practices and rituals, such as their borderline child abductions, which obviously turn problematic real fast in a real-world setting. And lastly, there's the consequences for the Sith, who were supposed to be this shadow reflection of the light that symbolically captured everything that the way of the Jedi is not, such as isolation instead of connection, power instead of cooperation, hate instead of love, and so on. But now they seem to have become just another ideology in the mix, just another viewpoint to be considered and debated.
That's the path to the dark side.
Semantics.
But you know, as easy as it is to just pin all this on The Last Jedi and the later stories that followed its trend, all this isn't actually the real problem. Schrodinger's Jedi is not about what the Jedi are or have become, it's specifically about what they are not, what they have not and cannot become. Because remember, the sequel gave us not one, but two visions about the Jedi. One that indeed tried to set in motion this more sociological course.
It's time for the Jedi to end.
But also another one that is actively pulling back against it, that remains firmly attached to the old, more mythological one, even if it can only offer a pale imitation of it.
A Jedi's weapon deserves more respect.
I'm talking of course about J.J. Abrams' complete course correction that was The Rise of Skywalker, which reset the stakes to that more simplified good and evil binary, symbolically repaired that broken helmet, gave Rey a more classical destiny, and you know.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
And beyond the sequel trilogy, this trend, this inclination to reach back into the past for more classical storytelling, also continued in some of the subsequent shows that first and foremost seem to want to remind us of the good old days. Want to momentarily ignore that critical examination of the Jedi principles to instead give us that traditional grand hero versus villain moment. In part because Disney wants to keep selling their action figures, but also in part because there is a genuine sentiment here, an understandable attachment to the mythopoetic quality and just the sheer cinematic power that the Jedi so clearly have to offer.
The majority of my colleagues can't imagine a galaxy without the Jedi, and I can understand why.
But by sitting right next to that other trend, the result is a constant friction between two conflicting visions that now feels like it has cemented itself in Star Wars as a whole. It's Luke throwing the lightsaber away in one movie and catching it in the next. It's why we get both the Jedi are problematic story and the uncritical nostalgia bait. It's the Jedi must go and I am all the Jedi, with neither of these opposites being allowed their full expression. This is Schrodinger's Jedi. This is the true identity crisis. The constant oscillation between competing perceptions of what the Jedi are supposed to be and what place they are supposed to occupy in the modern Star Wars universe. So now let's talk solutions. How can Star Wars get itself unstuck? How can it move forward? Well, obviously, I think that first and foremost they have to commit to a vision. They have to set a direction and follow it through. They have to decide if at its heart, Star Wars is a mythological reflection of matters of the heart and soul, or a social-political examination of matters of the world. For the sake of nuance, this is not a black and white distinction, it's never truly one or the other, and the last thing I want to do is offer up a false dichotomy, but the point is that at the end of the day, what is the fundamental anchoring point? What is the central pillar, the bedrock that the story of the Jedi rests upon? It's an important question because what works for one story might not work for another. For example, I think a more grounded, real-world approach worked great for The Dark Knight.
See, their morals, their code, it's a bad joke.
But much less so for The Man of Steel.
The world has been so caught up with what Superman can do that no one has asked what he should do.
As for Star Wars, I don't have too strong of a personal opinion about what the right course of action should be. I've never been that attached to the franchise to begin with, but I can imagine multiple directions yielding interesting results.
An external review of the Jedi must begin immediately.
Continuing down the road of The Last Jedi and The Acolyte, I think fully incorporating the Jedi as political actors rather than mythological figures could work, as it would open them up to new meanings and new places within the story. They can still be generally good and noble, but when truly released from old sentiment and convention, freed from their perpetual binary conflict with the Sith, they can also be much more, become enriched with new alliances, new conflicts, new dynamics, which I'd say is something that the franchise in general is in dire need of right now, and which I think is what The Last Jedi actually tried to do.
It's time to let old things die. The Sith, the Jedi, the Rebels, let it all die.
I go into more detail about this in the Nebula video, but I don't even believe The Last Jedi was all that subversive when it comes down to it. Despite Luke being more conflicted, and despite the movie proclaiming how the Jedi must end and the past must be forgotten, the traditional join me offer from the dark side is still rejected, and the ending actually affirms, rather than dismantles, the Jedi's undying existence.
I will not be the last Jedi.
In this sense, besides being sandwiched between J.J. Abrams' nostalgic sentimentalism, the real problem with The Last Jedi might actually be that it wasn't subversive enough, that it was still too connected to the old to really become something new.
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope.
That being said, I can see it going in the other direction too, see Star Wars re-embrace its more mythological roots. Because I also believe that the sentiment that Star Wars and its audience holds towards the Jedi is not just a token of nostalgia. It's also a genuine connection to that different mode of storytelling and signifies the value of and subsequent longing for mythologically meaningful escapism. I think it's a misguided idea that the sort of postmodern deconstruction that we've been seeing a lot of in popular media is the only way to add complexity and depth to a story. Like, we don't have to break everything down until it's gone, all swallowed up in purely rational concepts that directly mirror our own society. In fact, it feels like the DC universe is already going through somewhat of a course correction in this regard, which is now in the hands of James Gunn and already has a clearly different vibe than what we were getting before from Zack Snyder.
Superman's a different sort of world. There aren't really, it's not about real people in a real world. It's about this mythical DC universe.
Anyways, I think Star Wars could definitely move in a similar direction. I think it's perfectly possible to stay true to that more classical vision of the Jedi while still innovating and expanding upon it. In this case, however, you wouldn't be changing the Jedi so much as you'd be changing the context around them. For example, I'm actually kind of surprised there hasn't yet been a true Jedi action movie. You know, something in the vein of The Raid or John Wick. Or, thinking a little bit bigger, we could have a grand-scale Jedi war epic like we were kind of teased with in the Clone Wars, but which I don't think has yet reached its full potential. Just a major conflict with the Jedi and Sith as the main battling forces, maybe set in a time where lightsabers and other forms of light-powered hand-to-hand combat were or have become the primary weapon of choice. Again, I personally don't have a strong preference for the best course of action. At this point, I just believe that any direction is better than what we are getting now, which is no commitment at all. Because the thing is, the lack of vision is not just hurting the Jedi, but in many ways it's keeping the entire story in stasis, which in turn obviously has consequences for the future of the franchise, for all the stories that are still coming out. But it's something that can also be retroactively damaging everything that came before, the existing story world that we already know and love. This, however, is a slightly different issue, one that I'm going to explore in more detail in my next video, where I'll be building on the ideas presented here, but examine them through a different movie. One that I think also wanted to be multiple things at once, and in doing so, not only hurt itself, but also quietly undermined the beloved original that preceded it. In the meantime, my video essay on The Last Jedi is live right now exclusively on Nebula, which you can access with a 40% discount if you use my personal link. Revisiting the movie now, 8 years after its controversial release, was honestly a lot more insightful than I initially thought it would be. I was able to really get into the nitty-gritty of it and examine a lot of elements such as its characterizations, plotting and world building that I haven't seen too many people talk about. I get that they wanted some character arc for him, but to me it felt like they deliberately regressed his character just to get him back to the place where he already was. As you probably know, there's an enormous amount of exclusive material on Nebula just waiting for you to be enjoyed. It's the only place to see my discussion on World War Z, my autopsy of Jurassic World Dominion, and my examination of the paradoxical nature of space games, to name but a few examples. There's also hours and hours of amazing exclusive content from other creators such as Thomas Flight, Patrick Willems, Jacob Keller, Lindsay Ellis, and many, many more. All of which you could be watching right now completely ad-free with a 40% discount that's available through my personal link. And to make things even better, Nebula is a creator-owned streaming service that shares its revenue with its creators. Which means that if you subscribe to Nebula through my personal link, you're also directly supporting me and my work. There simply is no better way to simultaneously get the best ad-free viewing experience, the greatest amount of exclusive content, while also directly supporting your favorite creators. And again, be sure to claim that 40% discount by signing up using my personal link to become part of the most exciting streaming platform today.